to show you how to make a housing joint. This is a through housing joint. We have a housing cut in one piece of wood so that the other piece of wood fits into it. The tools we will need to do this job are the following: pencil, ruler, tri-square and marking gauge for marking out, marking knife, saw, chisel and mallet for cutting the joint. The first thing we must do, having decided the position of the joint, is to measure the second piece of wood to decide how wide the joint will need to be. My second piece of wood is 15 millimeters wide. It's actually 14 3/4, and those quarter millimeters are important, but this is so close we could call it 15. The first mark I made on my wood is the position that we want the joint, and then I mark the width of the joint, in this case 15. Using the tri-square and ensuring the stock of the tri-square is against the edge of the wood, I draw a line through my mark and repeat that for the second line. It's essential at this stage that we check that the lines that we've drawn are the correct distance apart. If they're not, they can be rubbed out, but once the joint is cut, we can't. These two lines are then continued across the first edge, trying to ensure that they line up exactly with the first line at the corner, and across the second edge. We now have to mark out the depth of the joint, and this can vary. To decide how deep to make your joint, you'll need to refer to your textbook or discuss with your teacher. Mine will be halfway through. I will need to set my marking gauge to half the width of my wood. My wood is 15, so I'll set the marking gauge to half of 15, which is 7.5. It's very important that we set the marking gauge accurately. Notice how I hold the ruler. Now, making sure the stock is touching the side where we've drawn our first lines, I make a marking gauge line along the wood just a little further than my two marks. We need to repeat this on the other edge of the wood. It's important when using a marking gauge that the spur of the marking gauge trails and that the stock remains in contact with the side of the wood. That's the marking out nearly completed. The last and most important part is to cross-hatch the waste. That's the wood we're going to remove. This is important so that we saw on the waste side of the line when we cut the joint. If we were going to mark out several pieces of wood, perhaps the two sides of a small cabinet, then rather than marking out across the face of the wood, we place our piece of wood lined up in the vise, and we measure off along the edge the position of the first joint, the width of the first joint, etc., along the wood, and using the tri-square, draw a line across both edges so that all of our joints are in line on both sides of the cabinet. We can then draw lines across the face of each piece of wood to complete the marking out. Returning to our marked out joint, we're now ready to cut the joint. Our first task is to marking knife along the line. We place the marking knife point in the line, slide the tri-square along and make our mark. We repeat the same with the second line. Not a bad idea at this stage to do a final check of the width of the joint. Now we're ready for sawing. I'm working on this type of bench which has an end vise with dogs in it which will grip my work. If you're on the other sort of bench, you'll need a bench hook in the vise. If it is a very wide joint where you're not sure about your sawing, it's possible to use a piece of spare wood clamped to your work to guide your saw, like this. The sort of saw that we're using is a tenon saw. We could use a slightly smaller version, which is called a dovetail saw. They both do the same job. Select the one which suits you best. We're going to saw along the waist side of the line. That means that we're going to saw on the side of the line into the waist. So that we're sawing half the pencil line away and leaving half on the wood. Now it's very important with a fitted joint, where we require a second piece of wood to fit into the joint, that it is exactly the right width. If we saw along the line or even outside the line, of course the joint will be loose. Starting on the corner away from myself, I begin the saw cut and gradually level the saw as I saw. If I tried to saw the saw level straight away, the saw would skid about and mark the wood. Notice that I'm sawing with a straight wrist, my elbow close to my body, my finger pointing along the saw. Having sawn the saw on level, I saw down the line on the edge to the marking gauge lines. If I don't keep the saw level, the middle of the cut may not be completely sawn. I'm now going to saw the second line, once again on the waist side of the line. Once the cut is started, saw the saw level. Keep sawing down to the gauge lines, checking that the saw touches both of the gauge lines at the same time. That's the sawing completed. Once again, we attach the wood into the tail vise and we need to select a chisel. It's most important when using chisels that we know and remember the safety rules, and that the chisel always lives, when not in use, in a secure place on the bench. We also will need a mallet, and the first task is to chisel away the bulk of the waste wood. We do this in the following way: holding the chisel on the top and pointing it slightly uphill, we tap it with the mallet to cut the waste away. If I turn the wood around in the alternative position, you'll see that more clearly. Right. Hold the chisel slightly uphill, tap it with the mallet, so that you're taking a sloping cut to remove some of the waste. It's important that you don't chisel out from the other edge of the wood. I'm taking cuts of about 1 or 2 millimeter depths, and the final cut, I position the chisel accurately in the gauge line and chop slightly uphill. I now need to turn the wood round and do the same from the other side. So, positioning the chisel 1 or 2 millimeters down, slightly uphill, chisel, that's the bulk of the waste removed. We have a hill in the middle of the joint. I'm now going to re-secure the wood this way round to show you how to complete the chiselling. We're now going to hand pare the waste wood away. It's most important that both hands touch the chisel rather than holding the wood with one hand so that the chisel points towards your wrist. It's obviously fairly lethal. Both hands must touch the chisel. When we're paring, once again, by altering the angle of chisel, we can either cut nothing, or we can cut just the surface of the wood, or we can dig the chisel into the wood. So by altering the angle of the chisel, we can cut more or less. I'm going to pare away the top of the hill that we left in the joint. I should try not to pare out on the far side, so I'll need to turn the wood around and pare from that side. When you think you've nearly got the paring finished, you can test it with a tri-square. If you put some pencil along the edge of the tri-square blade, it will leave black marks where the wood is still high. So long as those black marks are not at the very edges, which are already at the correct depth as we have a marking gauge line, then we can pare the black marks away, taking off as small amount as possible at each cut. See if you can cut 1/4 millimeter thickness away. And keep reversing the wood to work from opposite sides, so the chisel is never leaving the wood. I can clean away those black marks and test. Once again, pare away where the pencil mark has been left. And check with a tri-square. Pare again. Reverse the wood regularly so that you work from either side. This is a process really of checking and paring finer and finer amounts away from the joint. One last thing, to keep the chisel level in this direction, if that's difficult or you've lost the level, then hold the chisel on the surface of the wood, try to program your wrist and hold it still.